Which investments should you draw from first in retirement? How can a Roth 401k or Roth IRA help you handle financial emergencies in retirement? And is rolling a 401k into an IRA ever a bad idea? We'll answer these questions and more on this, the 121st episode. That's right, the 121st episode of the DoughRoller podcast.
Welcome to the DoughRoller podcast, where the best thing money can buy is financial freedom. We help you make more, spend less, and invest the rest. And now your host, Rob Berger.
Whether you're just starting out, buried under a mountain of debt, or well on your way to financial freedom, this is the podcast to help you take your finances to the next level. Hey, everybody. Hope you're having a great day. We have a guest on the show today. Stuart Ritter is going to join us. He is from Rowe Price. I met the folks there from Rowe at FinCon, the Financial Bloggers Conference I attended in New Orleans not too long ago, or New Orleans, I guess, as they say down there. And had a question that folks had, I've gotten different emails over the years about this question that he's going to help us address. And it's this. When you enter retirement, you may have, hopefully, traditional retirement accounts like a 401k or IRA. You may have Roth accounts, and, of course, taxable accounts. And that raises a question: where do you draw from first? You're gonna, your first year in retirement, you're gonna pull some money out, along with hopefully your Social Security or other sources of income. What do you tap first? The taxable accounts, the retirement, traditional accounts, the Roth accounts, or does it matter? Maybe it doesn't matter at all. Just take from wherever. And I thought, well, let's get an expert. Let's reach out to someone who does this, helps people with this very kind of issue. And so I reached out to Rowe Price, and Stuart was good enough to come on the show, so we're going to hear from him in just a minute. I do want to get right to that interview. But real quick, before I do, I wanted to mention a podcast that I recorded. Let's see here. I'm going to pull the number up for you. 111. Podcast 111. It was about 401k rollovers. And, sort of some things to think about. Should you roll over your 401k to an IRA? Should you roll it over to your new employer's 401k if that's your situation? Should you leave it where it is at your old employer? What should you, what should you do with it? And had folks email me about that podcast and made, actually one person emailed me with a suggestion. And then Stuart, in this interview you're going to hear, actually mentioned something that I think ties into rollovers. So I want to real quick address those right now. The first is, one listener emailed me and said, well, you got to be careful if you roll it over to an IRA, a 401k into a traditional IRA, it could affect your ability to do a backdoor Roth. And he is absolutely, absolutely correct. If you recall, we did a show on backdoor Roths. It's where maybe if you don't qualify to open up a Roth, but you can contribute after-tax dollars to a traditional IRA and then sort of immediately convert it into a Roth because there's no income limitations now on the conversion. There generally won't be any tax because you've already paid the tax on it unless there's maybe some earnings in the account if you don't roll it over right away. And it's a way to kind of get your money into a Roth IRA, and it'll grow tax-free. But if you have traditional pre-tax IRAs as well, the IRS will factor all that in, and you'll have to do they'll figure out what proportion of your rollover relates to your after-tax dollars and what portion relates to your pre-tax dollars, and you'll get taxed on some of that. You can't say, well, I'm just going to roll this one over here, ignore this IRA, maybe even at a different institution. The IRS treats all of your IRAs as one, so you can't do that. So that's a very good point. If you're looking at a backdoor Roth, you'll want to factor that in before you roll over any 401ks into an IRA. And I'm quickly here trying to get the show notes for you for the backdoor Roth. Yeah, it was episode 40. So if you're listening and you're saying, Rob, I have absolutely no earthly idea what a backdoor Roth is, go to episode 40, DoughRoller.net/podcast 40, and you'll hear all about it. The second thing I want to mention, this is something that comes up in more detail in my interview with Stuart here that I'll get to in just a minute, is that there's an RMD, required minimum distribution, for your 401ks and IRAs once you hit that magic number, 70 and a half, right? Well, if you keep working after 70 and a half, it delays your required minimum distributions for the 401k at that employer. So if you work past 70 and a half, you have a 401k at that employer, you don't have to start taking the required minimum distributions until you eventually retire. Well, here's the deal. You can roll an old 401k at a previous employer into your current employer that you're going to work at past 70 and a half and avoid the RMDs for all of that, all of the money that's in your current employer's 401k, whether you contributed it while you were there or rolled it over from a previous employer. So if you're thinking about working past 70 and a half and you'd love to, defer the RMD past that time, again, it only applies for the 401k at your current job that you're working at. But you can roll over previous employers' 401ks into that 401k. It'll all count to avoid or to delay the RMD past 70 and a half if you continue to work. A very important factor. Stuart mentions it in the interview, as you'll hear in a minute, but I wanted to relate it to the 401k rollover podcast because it's very relevant to that consideration. Just another factor to think about, as you plan. So again, that's podcast 111 on the 401k rollover, DoughRoller.net/podcast 111. Okay, with that, I want to get right to the interview. This was a great interview. I learned a lot. I think you will too. So let's welcome Stuart to the show. Stuart, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So we were just chatting. So Rowe Price is headquartered in Baltimore?
It is.
Okay. And you've got the Orioles playing the Tigers right behind you right now.
Yes, as we are speaking, the Orioles won the first game, and at this very moment, they're a little bit behind, but hoping they pull ahead. So if in the middle of the recording you hear a big giant roar, that's because we've moved ahead. And
did you go to the game last night or yesterday?
I unfortunately did not get that chance.
The Nationals play today at 3, and
yes.
I'm not able to go to that. Although I am going tomorrow to see the Ohio State Buckeyes play Maryland. So
there you go. Well, I graduated from Maryland, so we might have to stop this recording right now.
We might, because
we'll keep going.
Well, you've probably guessed I'm a Buckeye fan. So, although Virginia Tech beat them, so I don't know. I think the prognosticators think that Maryland will lose, but you never know. I mean, Virginia.
True. Any given Sunday or Saturday.
Right. Well, Virginia
Friday
Tech.
afternoon.
Virginia Tech beat us in Columbus, so I mean that's not good. Anyway,
that's tough.
Well, hey, I appreciate your time today. Why don't we just start off? So you're obviously at T. Rowe Price, but kind of give everybody just a little bit of background about who you are and what you do.
Sure, I'm a senior financial planner here. I have the Certified Financial Planner designation, and the way I describe my role at T. Rowe Price is to talk about the fact that in the health industry, there are clinical physicians that meet with patients every day, and then there are research physicians that work in a lab. My role here is to be a research financial planner. My role is to understand what issues people are facing, what questions they have, and then do the research to come up with new and better ways for them to answer those questions. And then, obviously, I then share that with the folks we have at T. Rowe who are meeting with people every day, as well as talk to people like yourself who are also trying to help people understand the issues that they're facing and make good decisions so that they can achieve the goals that they're trying to achieve.
Okay. Now, do the results of your research ever get published anywhere?
All the time. Everything from media like Money Magazine and the Wall Street Journal to articles that we at T. Rowe Price will put on our website or in our own publications. So that is very much one of the ways we try to share that information with people.
Okay, good. And forgive me, as people that listen to this podcast know, I've been fighting a cold that seems like it's gone on forever. So I'll try to keep my coughing to a minimum.
No problem.
So I was doing a little research on you. I like to research on my guests, and I noticed that you teach personal finance at a personal finance course at Johns Hopkins University. How did that come about?
I did. I was teaching at Howard Community College, which is one of the local colleges, personal finance course. And the folks in one of the programs at Johns Hopkins University wanted to start up a personal finance course for their undergraduates. And I knew somebody who knew somebody there and was asked to put that class together. And it was myself and 2 other professors. And I had the fabulous opportunity for 3 years to teach personal finance to undergraduates, mostly seniors, a couple of juniors in there, This was a couple of years ago when my wife and I had our third child. I needed to be home a little bit more, so stopped doing that. But for a couple of years, had the opportunity to do what I was describing earlier, which is take a lot of this complicated personal finance stuff and figure out ways to communicate it to people who are not steeped in the topic as you and I are, and help them understand it well enough so that they can make good decisions.
Do they still have that course today at Johns Hopkins?
I don't think they do. I think they stopped offering it, and they were talking about offering it again. I'm not sure it's there. Financial education overall is getting more attention, so you do see more schools picking it up. You see it more in the K through 12 area as well. I think there's a recognition that helping people understand these topics then helps them make better decisions. So there are more initiatives to do exactly that, and certainly more initiatives to get to people younger. The decisions that folks are making in their early 20s now are very different from the ones that were made a generation ago. Retirement was a DB plan. You really didn't need to know much about it until you were getting ready to retire. Healthcare was
a DB plan. Is that a defined benefit plan?
Yes, I'm sorry.
That's
Defined
okay.
benefit pension plan. One of those old world ones that
I wish I had one of those.
Yes. So there's more effort now to help people understand what's going on, and of course that extends to folks who are getting close to retirement as well. So at Hopkins, I was lucky enough to be able to stand in front of some wonderful students in a classroom for a number of semesters. And that's just a continuation of what I try to do here at T. Rowe, which is, again, helping people understand the issues they face and make good decisions.
Do you remember what textbook you used in that class, if you used one?
I did, and I have to confess I don't remember the name of it, and it's probably out of print by now anyway. They change them on a regular basis. One of the things we did use, though, were a couple of more popular, off-the-shelf Amazon kinds of books. There are a number of them out there that are helpful for folks.
Which ones were they? Which ones did you use?
Well, probably not something I could share in this venue.
Okay.
But my point is that folks can learn a lot from a number of sources. It doesn't necessarily have to be an academic textbook, but a number of the books you can read and just get more education yourself on a particular topic is also a good source as well.
Did you find any topics that you were teaching within personal finance that students seem to struggle with the most?
For younger folks, going through the process of prioritization was somewhat of a new concept for them and something they recognized they needed to work through. Because when you're a student, your expenses are way more than your income because you're paying tuition. So having to make trade-offs based on a set income really isn't part of the decisions they're making. Now, a lot of students will set budgets and parents will set budgets and they have to work within that. But the idea that when you go out into the working world and now you're earning $40,000 a year and you need to make your housing and your transportation and your food and your entertainment and your retirement savings and all of that work within that very defined amount of money was an experience none of them had had before. So I took them through a number of exercises to help them go through that process of recognizing that right from the beginning you're making those trade-offs, and you continue making those trade-offs throughout your entire life. It's not as if you get to be 30 years old and you get a raise and suddenly, whew, I never have to worry about money again because I can get whatever I want. So recognizing that it's something you do throughout your lifetime and getting an early start in making those good decisions was something, since the students hadn't dealt with, was fairly new for them.
Yeah, I get questions about prioritization all the time. Should I pay off my debt, my credit card debt first, or save for retirement? Should I save for in a 529 plan for my child's education, or save for retirement? And we're making those trade-offs every day, including when we spend our money on everyday things as well, I guess. So that is a tough issue, and one that sometimes there's just not an easy answer. Sometimes we try to make it easier than it is, but that's a tough one. Okay.
It is, and I think, yeah.
No, go ahead.
You got it.
Yeah, I mean, one question I answered recently was should they pay off their home or save for retirement? That's another one. Should they pay off their mortgage early? That's always a big one. But so today we're going to talk about talking about prioritization. This is a perfect segue. So for folks that are nearing retirement or in retirement, many of them have multiple accounts that they can draw from for retirement income. They can have their traditional, 401k and IRAs. They can have Roth retirement accounts, and then taxable accounts, and then I suppose on top of that any form of annuities, whether it's Social Security or whatever. And the question is, how should they go about thinking through which accounts to draw down from first? So that's kind of what we want your help with today. And can I just kind of throw it out there to begin with, that sort of very broad question? How should one start to go about thinking through that question? Where do they draw what account types do they draw from first?
Let's start with a guideline. So I'll answer the question directly, so that people have a starting point and recognize, well, for my personal situation, I'm going to have to make adjustments. But then from that starting point, it makes it easier to discuss the pros and cons and the whys and when do you make a different decision. So generally speaking, for most people, it's reasonable for them to withdraw from their taxable accounts first, their tax-deferred accounts second. Those would be things like traditional IRAs and traditional 401ks. And from their essentially tax-free accounts third, and that would be Roth 401ks and Roth IRAs. Now, that changes a little bit when you get to age 70 and a half, and required minimum distributions come into the picture, in which case, of course, legally you have to take a minimum distribution from your traditional accounts, traditional IRAs and traditional 401ks. So when you reach that age, then you would want to take that required minimum distribution out first, and then the rest from taxable first, tax-deferred second, and tax-free third.
Okay, and so on that's sort of the general rule of thumb. As you said, there might be exceptions or different results in specific circumstances, which we'll get to. But with sort of the general rule of thumb you've just laid out for us, taxable accounts, tax-deferred, and then Roth, and then, of course, factoring in the required minimum distribution. Why? Why is that sort of the general rule of thumb?
Well, the taxable one is fairly easy. When you think about the distinction between all these accounts is the tax treatment. Let's assume I've got the exact same investments in all three kinds of accounts. So we take the investment piece out of the equation for a moment. What it means is whatever I'm invested in my taxable account, every year I pay taxes on some of those earnings, whatever the realized either gains or short-term distributions and interest are. So essentially the growth in my taxable account is lower. It's growing more slowly than the growth I'm getting in my tax-deferred and my tax-free accounts, because I have to pay taxes every year in the taxable account, but I don't in the other ones. So there's more money left in those accounts, and therefore there's more growth. The same growth is happening on more money, so I earn more, which means if I'm going to choose where to withdraw my money from first, it makes sense to withdraw it from the account that's growing the slowest. Because if I leave the other accounts alone, the longer they have to grow, the more money I'd end up with at the other end, all other things being equal. If instead I say took my money out of a tax-deferred account, well, then I have less money growing tax without the tax drag on it. I've left the money in a taxable account, but I'm paying taxes on it every year, so it's not growing as fast. Better not do that one. Take the money from the taxable account first, because it allows the money that's got the tax benefits to continue growing, and it's growing at a faster rate. Okay.
And just thinking this through, so the Roth, of course, has no tax consequences when you take it out.
Right.
As between the taxable and the tax-deferred, I guess the tax-deferred would have the most significant tax ramifications because it's coming out and being taxed at 100%, although it's being taxed at ordinary income levels.
Right.
And at the taxable level, it's going to be a lot of it long-term gains, and of course it's not going to all be taxable. You're going to have some basis in it, presumably.
Right. And that trade-off gets into, when I'm then making the withdrawal, what's the effect for my personal situation? What tax rate am I in? What other capital gains might I have? Those are the things where now it makes sense to kind of go to that second level and say, okay, I know what the starting point is, but now let me look at what my personal situation is to make sure that still makes sense.
Right. Okay, but sticking with the general rule for a moment, I guess, so if I understand it, one, by starting with your taxable accounts, you allow your tax-deferred and Roth accounts to continue to grow and enjoy the tax benefits that they offer. And then again, on the taxable side, the taxes you're going to pay oftentimes are long-term capital gains, and that won't be on 100% of what you withdraw because some portion of it's going to be part of your basis. Is that sort of the rationale behind the sort of general rule of thumb?
That's part of it, absolutely.
Okay. And then now just kind of playing the devil's advocate here, I'm curious, since you're the research, you do a lot of research at Rowe Price, you read about other strategies. Are the folks in the industry pretty much in agreement that is, as a starting point, there are exceptions, but as a starting point, that's the general rule of thumb? Or are there those out there that actually disagree with the order the sequence you've just given and actually propose a different rule of thumb?
Well, both of those can be true at the same time.
Yeah.
Most folks agree that is the right starting point. And then for any guideline that anybody gives, as you know, there's always somebody who says, oh, no, that's not the right one. But to a large degree, that is the consensus. The starting point would be taxable first, tax-deferred second, and tax-free third. Okay.
And then, excuse me, I know we're going to get to some exceptions, but one thing I was curious about, because you mentioned the required minimum distribution, which kicks in at age 70 and a half, right? As folks are maybe in retirement and they're not yet to the RMD age, they're in their 60s, let's say, should they be looking at which accounts to draw from or even to do a Roth conversion if need be, to affect what the RMD will be when they hit 70 and a half? Should they take into account strategies to maybe lower, or I guess you couldn't raise it, whatever it is, whatever you have in those accounts it will be. But is there ever a time when they should implement strategies to try to lower their eventual required minimum distribution?
I would say that you shouldn't do something just to lower the required minimum distribution, because that is far too narrow of a definition of success. There are lots of things people do to lower their taxes that leave them with less net worth at the other end because they've focused on just one aspect instead of seeing the big picture. So doing something just so your RMD is lower may not be the right thing to do in the long term. So what I would say is, if you're looking at things from a macro level and you're thinking about what effect will this have on my cash flow, what effect will this have on my net worth, and not just today, but in the long term, if you're using that as your definition of success, that's how you then evaluate whether any particular strategy makes sense. So it's not just, if I do this, will it lower my RMDs? It should be, if I do this, will this give me more money in the long run? Mm-hmm. And from that perspective, then there may be some things you can do that modify that starting point and do end up giving you more money at the other end. For example, there are some folks that say, well, it's all well and good to take the money from the taxable account, but figure out that if you take a little bit from your tax-deferred account and you fill up the tax bracket you're in, and forgive me, I don't know the tops of the tax brackets offhand, but if you're in the 25% tax bracket, maybe you withdraw enough from your tax-deferred accounts to stay in the 25% tax bracket, so you're only paying 25% from that required minimum distribution, and that way when you get to 70 and a half and maybe have to take out a larger amount that otherwise would have had some of it taxed at the 28% tax bracket, you've avoided having it taxed at 28% because you took it out earlier at the 25%. That could certainly help you out. Now, it requires a lot of calculations. It requires knowing how far into a tax bracket you are. So one of the trade-offs with some of the strategies are, the extra complexity and level of effort that it introduces into what's otherwise a fairly simple approach. So you can look at some of these things and say, yeah, it may help me out. Just be aware of what kind of complexity and efforts you might be introducing when you're doing those.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And you did hit on kind of my thinking, and that was, if it makes sense, your RMDs might put you into a higher tax bracket, right? And so if you know that, a few years in advance, you might either do through a Roth conversion or simply withdrawing from 401ks and IRAs. You might be able to, pay a lower tax at that time, and at the same time reduce your RMDs down the road that would keep you in a lower tax bracket. But as you said, it does require a lot of calculations and even some assumptions about future tax rates.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Both what they will be and where you will be at any given point. And one of the things that we also need to recognize is that withdrawals aren't steady. We don't live our lives where we're spending, we spent a certain amount the first year we got out of college, and our spending is exactly 3% higher for inflation every year after that.
Right.
We spend a certain amount certain years, and then one year we're buying a car. One year there's a medical event. So our spending goes up and down with somewhat frequent spikes. The same thing will happen in retirement. You'll go a couple of years where you're spending at a certain rate, and then one year you take that big trip you've always been thinking of. Or one year you're buying a new car. Or one year you have a major medical event. So there are these spikes in spending. And that's part of the reason we have Roth decked as the last thing to withdraw from. Because if I've got, say, a $40,000 lifestyle, and then one year I suddenly have an extra $20,000 of expenses. Maybe it's that trip, maybe it's the car, maybe it's a health expense, maybe it's all three the same year. Well, if I have a 50% increase in the amount I'm withdrawing, I'm in the higher tax bracket. If I'm pulling it all out of my traditional accounts, my tax-deferred accounts, all of that money is considered taxable income. So it affects the taxability of my Social Security benefits. It affects my Medicare premium. As I mentioned, it could push you into a higher tax bracket. So all of those things then lead us to say, well, wait a second, if on the year that you have this big spike, if that's the year where you've reserved your Roth money and it's still available so that you can take that, in my example, extra $20,000 out of the Roth, it all comes out tax-free. So you're not affecting your Medicare premium. You're not affecting your Social Security benefits. It gives you a lot of flexibility for the real world and what really happens in terms of the way people spend their money. That it's not this smooth curve that those of us in the ivory tower sometimes start with our modeling. It's what goes on in the real world. It's those spiky expenses, and it gives you the flexibility to handle them in a way that doesn't end up costing you more money because you had this giant taxable event in one year.
That's a fantastic point, Stuart. I mean, I hadn't thought of it that way, and yeah, the Roth, if you have it, will give you the ability to handle those spikes in your spending, and also the fact that if your income does go up, your taxable income does go up, it affects a lot more than just which tax bracket you're in. As you said, you could affect Social Security, Medicare. That's terrific. Very helpful. Okay, well, let's get to the exceptions then. So, we've got our rule of thumb: taxable, then tax deferred, then Roth. Obviously, factoring in the RMDs when you hit 70.5. Are there times when folks ought to maybe consider a different approach?
Yeah, one of them was what I just described. So I've got this spiky expense. So if I theoretically could handle it by making my full withdrawal from a tax-deferred account, well, that would be a situation where you go to the Roth bucket and pull the money out from there, even if you still have some money in the tax-deferred account. There can also be the opposite. You've got a particular year where your tax rate is particularly low for whatever reason. You didn't spend much that year. You didn't make very many withdrawals that year. Your tax rate is low. You brought it up a couple of times. Let's throw it in there. That might be the year where you convert some of your traditional money to Roth, because if you know you're going to be in a low tax bracket, paying when you do the conversion, whatever amount you convert is considered taxable income. So if you pay the taxes then at the lower rate and you expect your rate to be higher later on, well, then you make the withdrawal from the Roth and avoid that higher rate later on. So as you get a sense of what your kind of base lifestyle is and what your tax situation is, as you start seeing that vary, that's when you can start thinking about what other things you might do that, as I alluded to earlier, would over the long term lower your taxes, lower your expenses, and ultimately give you more money to spend.
Yeah, I can imagine in that latter example, if you're before 70 and a half, so you don't have an RMD, you're living primarily off of taxable accounts, you may have very little ordinary income, right? You'll have some capital gains, you'll have some ordinary income, presumably, but you may have relatively very little, and that may be a good time, as you've just described, to convert some of your traditional retirement accounts over to a Roth.
Yes, and you and I have both used a word that I want to highlight, and that's the word sum. When you do a conversion, when you take some of your tax deferred money and convert it to a Roth, you're allowed to do whatever amount you want. It's not as if you have $100,000 into a traditional IRA, that you have to convert the entire amount over to a Roth. Boy, if you did that and had the whole $100,000 income, that would have a huge impact on your taxes. You can convert the amount that you want. So there's flexibility depending upon your situation in when you do it, whether or not you do it, and if so, how much you convert.
Yeah, that's a great point. Okay. I had a few specific questions. I'm wondering, and maybe it's just a tax analysis, but a lot of folks in retirement are still working part-time. My mom, she's visiting and she hit 70 and a half. And so she's got the RMDs and I'm trying to help her with all that, but she works part-time as a substitute teacher. So she still has some earned income. I'm wondering, does that affect the equation in any way? I mean, I suppose, again, you can just analyze what tax bracket you're in and do some analysis there. But does the fact that folks might work part-time in retirement affect the sequencing of which accounts they should draw from?
It may. The two things that continuing to work, the way they would play into the discussion that we've had is, first of all, if you've started taking Social Security benefits and you're below your full retirement age, and you can go to the Social Security Administration website to figure out what that age is for you personally. The check you get from the Social Security Administration gets affected by how much you're earning. If you earn over a certain amount, the language is a little weird here. They don't give you the full amount. It kind of gets put back into a later paycheck. But it is something you're going to want to think about if you're still working in retirement and you're considering whether or not to start your Social Security benefits. Make sure you've spent some time researching what effect that working will have on your Social Security benefits. Now, let me be clear. It's not as if you're missing out on benefits. It's not as if there's some kind of, dollar for dollar, elimination that goes on. It's when you get the benefits, but there is an effect. So you're going to want to do some research on that. The other thing that continuing to work specifically past age 70 and a half does is all these required minimum distributions that we're talking about. You are required to start withdrawing money when you turn age 70 and a half from whatever traditional IRAs you have and whatever traditional 401ks you have, except from the 401k of the employer that you're actively working for. So if your mom is eligible for the 401k plan there, when she reaches age 70 and a half, she gets to avoid taking required minimum distributions from that particular 401k, which also means if you have money in an old employer's 401k and your new employer, the one you're currently working for, allows you to roll that money in, you have the opportunity to take the money from that old 401k, roll it into the new 401k, and since you're an active employee there, you now get to avoid RMDs on all of that money, rather than if you had left it in the old 401k, once you reach age 70 and a half, since you're no longer working for that old employer, you're required to take the money out. But if you roll it over to your current employer and you're an active employee, when you reach age 70 and a half, you avoid those RMDs until you leave that employer, and then they kick in.
Yeah, that's a great point. I just did a podcast on what you should consider in doing a rollover, and I mentioned the rule, the 55 rule. If you leave your employer in the year you turn 55 or later, you can take your withdrawals without the 10% penalty. But I neglected to mention the fact that if you continue to work past 70 and a half, it delays the RMDs. So that's a great point. Very helpful. Stuart, as I listened to your answer, one thing that struck me was just how much you obviously enjoy this stuff.
Well, thanks. I do. It's call me a geek, but I find it fascinating. But more importantly, this can make a big difference for people and their lifestyle and what they want to be able to do. And we're talking about terms like retirement and tax defer, but what we're really talking about is people who want to go out for dinner on the weekends and take a trip to the grandkids and go travel and make sure their roof doesn't leak and pay for the hip replacement when it's time to do that. And our opportunity to be more effective in doing that, to make decisions about our money that allow us to do those kinds of things, is something I think is really helpful for folks. So I'm glad, again, that you've had me on the show to help people hopefully understand this better and learn from what you're sharing with them so they can make those better decisions.
Yeah, it is. It does absolutely affect real life. I do have a few more questions for you if I can keep you just for a few minutes.
You bet.
Okay, so asset allocation. When you're saving for retirement, there's sort of general rules of thumb about which types of assets you should have in a taxable account versus a tax deferred account. So they'll say, for example, REITs and bonds should probably be in a tax deferred account if possible. A muni bond, which has tax break, should be in a taxable account. Just as a couple of examples, right? I'm wondering, though, so if you follow those sorts of rules of thumb and then you get to the point where you're starting to take assets out and you're taking assets out of, say, your taxable account to begin with, as you've described, any guidance on how you start to readjust your asset allocation and asset location as you do this? Or do you just kind of leave things where they are and take them out and go from there?
We are doing research on this right now. What I will say is that the asset allocation decision trumps the account decision. It is far more important that you have an appropriate asset allocation and appropriate diversification than it is that you're taking money from a taxable account versus a tax-deferred account. So what we want to avoid is someone who says, well, I have all of my bonds in a taxable account. I'm just making something up. So I'm going to spend all of my bonds first so that I end up with an asset allocation at age 75 that's 100% equity.
Right.
That is not where we want it to go.
Right.
Making sure your asset allocation is appropriate is far more important.
I'm sorry. Well, I didn't mean to cut you off, but is it more important than asset location as well?
Making sure that your overall asset allocation is appropriate is more important than asset location. Is how you can nuance that asset allocation and be more effective in those decisions. But you don't want to go so far with that you've then violated some more important rule. It goes back to the point I was making earlier about people saying, well, I want to lower my taxes, but then I'm going to do something that in the end has me end up with just less money overall. You don't want to let something that's farther down the funnel have you make a decision that overrides something at the beginning that has a bigger impact on your overall livelihood.
Right, and I suppose a lot of folks will have bonds, I think, in a tax deferred account, and maybe equity funds in a taxable account. But if they were to start to draw down those equity funds in their taxable account, they could pretty simply go into their retirement account and move some of the bond funds to maintain whatever their asset allocation is. Move some of those bond funds over to an equity fund within the retirement account.
There you go.
Right.
So if I'm doing something and I'm making sure that asset allocation is staying the same, as long as I recognize I need to do that and the additional complexity involved with all that, then it makes sense. Just want to make sure people aren't just doing one step, not the other, and then they get themselves in trouble.
Okay. One last question for you. Some folks want to design some of this with the plans to leave money to their children or perhaps to others. And so if that is important to somebody, how does that affect the sequencing from which they draw funds during retirement?
There are two ways it affects it. One is all of what we're talking about is based on a financial goal. And the financial goal implicit in this discussion is me and my retirement. How long I might live, when I'm going to use the money, how my expenses happen, and making good decisions to meet the financial goal I've set, which is my own retirement. So the first way it affects it is now we're talking about a different financial goal. We're not talking about me using the money in my own retirement. We're talking about, as an example, my kids or my grandkids using the money after I die, which means it's a different goal with a different time horizon, which implies different investing and so forth. So the first thing to bear in mind is the way to think about it is I'm no longer making the decisions based on my own retirement. I'm making the decisions on what would be most helpful for my kids or grandkids. It's another reason to withdraw from Roth last, because if your heirs get a Roth account when they make those withdrawals, and there are required withdrawals after your death from those accounts, some exceptions for your spouse, then they can take that money out without any tax consequences to themselves. If, on the other hand, they inherit a traditional account, just like you, when they take the money out, it counts as taxable income. So if they're in a certain tax bracket and now they inherit the traditional account and they're required to take money out, now they might be in a higher tax bracket, and it affects other things that are triggered off of adjusted gross income and so forth. But if they inherit a Roth account, the Roth allows them to take the money and not be included in their taxable income, and they avoid all that stuff. So the first thing to think about is this is a different financial goal, and I need to be making decisions about it differently. That's the first one. The balance to that, though, the second one is I still might need this money. It's all well and good that I want to give this to my children or grandchildren, but the reality is if I end up with a major health event, I still might need this money to pay for that. If I suddenly need long-term care, I might need this money to pay for that. I might change my mind and decide, you know what, I want one last bang-up trip around the world. I might still use that money. So it makes it a little tougher to decide how to do it because we've got two different financial goals that might blend into it. But it's important to recognize that's the case. And if you do, then as you started the show with, there might not be an easy answer, but at least you're thinking about the right things as you're coming to the decision that you get to.
Mm-hmm. What about so if you're going to kind of hold off on the Roth accounts to give to your heirs, that kind of works out nicely in terms of the sequencing because it's taxable, tax deferred, and Roth anyway. But I wonder about the taxable, particularly if you have assets in taxable account with significant unrealized gains. Does that affect the ordering because you get that stepped up basis?
Excellent point.
So how does that factor into it?
If I die, any unrealized gains that I have in an investment I have essentially disappears because the basis that I had when I bought this thing 30 years ago, it gets called stepped up to the value on the day I die. And therefore, at that point, there's no gain, so there's no tax. Something you definitely want to keep in mind as you're doing this and get that balance between, okay, I want to leave this for my kids, but I still might need the money. And recognize that then if you're not taking the money from the taxable account, because that's your strategy, you're going to start by taking it from the tax-deferred accounts. That's going to have an impact on how much taxes you're paying and affect your cash flow, and just make sure you're thinking all of that through as you're deciding what strategy you want to put in place.
Right. Well, this has been terrific, very informative, and even in the midst of the Orioles playing baseball. So, I can't believe I was so insensitive to pull you away from that, but you've been a good sport, and I appreciate it, particularly on a Friday afternoon. I guess I'll just kind of end it with any questions about this that I should have asked you that I didn't? Have we missed anything?
I think you've covered it all. The one I'd go back to is thinking about how much complexity you want to introduce. At some point, the distinctions between some of these decisions aren't that big. So it's not something people necessarily need to lose sleep over. Get the big stuff right. Make sure that in retirement you're spending a modest amount so that you're not spending so much that you'd run out of money, that you are making good decisions about the accounts you're drawing from, that you do have an appropriate asset allocation in place. If you get the big stuff down, then you can improve it with some of the things we've been talking about, but it's not as if it's 50% either way. So I encourage people not to get so caught up and so worried about these things that the concern about making sure it's perfect stresses them out so much that they don't realize that they're doing pretty darn well and can enjoy what they have and go live the retirement that they want.
Yeah, that sounds beautiful. All right, Stuart. Well, listen, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that interview with Stuart. As I said at the top of the show, I learned a lot from that, and he's just someone you can just tell he loves doing what he does. I learned a lot. I thought he was very good at explaining, what can be complicated topics. So I hope you learned a lot too. If you have any questions for Stuart, don't hesitate to shoot me an email, dr@DoughRoller.net, and I will forward them to him. And of course, as always, you can email me with questions, topics, whatever, dr@DoughRoller.net. Hey, hope you have a great day. Until next time, remember, the absolute best thing money can buy is financial freedom.